All right, so we see colleagues signing in from Seychelles, DC, Florida, Switzerland, New York, Tanzania, DC as well, Oregon, Normandy, LA, wow, Nigeria, everybody extremely welcome. So I think we can give it a go. While you will be super welcome to present yourself in the chat and let us know where you are. We were talking a minute ago the amount of carbon footprint that having a virtual session provides, despite that also has some impacts. But in the meantime, I think it's fair to give it a go so we can maximize the time for this event. Welcome to the AI session of today. This is an event that we have co-organized between different teams, the Education Global Practice, and also the World Bank Frontier Technology, which is organizing. This is the 12th seminar for them, but for the Global Practice, this is the third AI session that we have arranged. So we were joking a moment ago that this is a kind of trilogy of AI sessions. This session is going to be recorded and will be distributed later on. We have a packed agenda, but I think it's going to be very insightful. And I encourage everybody to share questions in the chat. We will try to identify some questions and gather them. And if times allow, we will bring these questions at the end of the session. If that questions are not addressed, we're going to share them with the panelists. But by all means, please share ideas and comments in the chat. I think that's going to be useful for all of us, not only for the panelists. So I think we can start with a framing. We want to dive into the world of AI and understand what is the implication for the sector of education. So we're going to have a 10-minute presentation from Pati Ruiz, Senior Director of EdTech and Emerging Technologies at Digital Promise in the US, formerly known in the past, many years ago, as the National Center for Research and Advanced Information and Digital Technologies. And I just mentioned that for people who might not be already familiar with Digital Promise. And then we will move into the panel, and we'll present the rest of the panelists. So, Pati, thank you so much for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Cristobal. I know I don't have too much time, so I'm going to go through these slides quickly. I just want to give everyone a little bit of background, next slide please, on who I am. I spent 16 years in the classroom. My undergraduate work focused on computer science, and my doctoral work focused on learning sciences and emerging technologies. And I've been in this space for a very long time. On the next two slides, you will see I put up a QR code so that folks could take a look at some definitions that my colleague Judy Fosco and I wrote up for educators, which translates some of these topics for educators and make these technological terms a little bit more accessible. So please check those out. One of the definitions that I really appreciate is from the recent White House executive order on the safe, secure, and trustworthy development and use of AI. And the White House uses a few terms that I've highlighted here on this slide that we really like. The first is that AI is a machine-based system that can, for a given set of human-defined objectives, make predictions, recommendations, or decisions influencing real or virtual environments. Artificial intelligence systems use machine and human-based inputs to perceive real and virtual environments. So we really appreciate the focus on the human-defined objectives and the human-based inputs. I'll talk about that in a little bit. The other definition that we really appreciated out of the White House recently was that of generative AI, our topic for today. And one of the things that we appreciate is the calling out of the synthetic content. So whenever we're using generative AI systems and tools, we need to be aware that the outputs are synthetic content, right? And they are built drawing from a base of data that was scraped from the internet in many different systems. And so we need to be aware of the potential copyright issues that may result in our use of these generative AI systems and tools. So my focus is around teaching and learning with generative AI. And at Digital Promise, we recently supported, on the next two slides, a report out of the Office of EdTech, the US Department of Education. In that report, we wrote about these technologies, these emerging technologies, as analogous to an electric bicycle, where the human should be fully aware and in full control of where they're navigating to and the direction. They're in control of the bike, unlike a robot vacuum where the tool just goes off and does whatever it needs to do. So with generative AI, we are hoping that humans remain at the center and that humans continue to be the ones propelling the tools that are being used, specifically when we're putting these in learning contexts. One thing that I wanted to return to that I know that Cristobal addressed in the 11th webinar, the one just previous to this one, is considerations for using generative AI to enhance our work, and specifically the intellectual property problem, which is on the next slide, that I mentioned briefly. So we need to make sure we're understanding the human-generated data that these machines and tools are built on. And we are aware in the United States of copyright infringement lawsuits that are being taken through the courts, and we need to make sure that we're asking ourselves whether or not this tool, this generative AI tool, is the right tool to be using in whatever situation we're bringing it into. So we've found that generative AI is a very useful planning tool. And it can be used to support educators and learners in many different situations. However, there are also times when we need to just turn to Google or any search engine that we have. So just like any emerging technology tool, we need to consider generative AI's affordances and ensure that it fits the task that we have it doing. On the next slide, we also want to consider environmental costs and the environmental impact of these generative AI tools. As we know, training and running these AI systems requires a great deal of computing power. When OpenAI trained its LLM, so GPT-3, that work produced the equivalent of around 500 tons of carbon dioxide. So we need to weigh the cost and benefit of using these AI systems and tools. On the next slide, another researcher identified that in training a different AI system, that training took as much energy as powering 30 homes in a full year. So she goes on to say, this is also that we can tell knock-knock jokes with generative AI tools. Again, it's important because not a lot of us think about the carbon impacts that these systems and tools have. Another societal impact on the next slide that we need to consider for these systems and tools is labor exploitation. So global data collection and labeling is an important task. On the next slide, we need to consider that there are humans doing the work of actually tagging and identifying these systems and tools so that we can use these large language models. So a lot of work goes on in the back end that is invisible to us users of these systems and tools. And we need to consider that there are humans making these very important tagging decisions so that we can use this tool seamlessly. And while it appears as a black box to us, there is a lot that goes into this work, and the labor hotspots for this work tend to be in Africa, in Venezuela, in the global South, and Philippines. Many times this work happens in refugee camps where companies can find cheap labor. So we need to be conscious of this, as it is an important consideration when we go to use these generative AI tools. So in the United States, the Center for Democracy and Technology just published a report that was released yesterday that gives us a little bit more information about what teachers in the United States are thinking about. And I think this has global considerations. So teachers are reporting that they need more guidance on what responsible use of generative AI systems and tools looks like, both for students as well as themselves. Another point is that teachers are considering student discipline due to generative AI. They are seeing that increase, and for us in the United States, we're seeing that students with disabilities and students who are historically and systemically excluded are the ones that are primarily being identified as needing discipline in this space. So next 2 slides. There is also teacher distrust in their students' academic integrity. This remains an issue that we need to address when it comes to the use of generative AI by students. And I did want to point out that a recent study out of Stanford identified that this concern, this cheating, on the next slide, that ChatGPT was not actually found in high schools to increase the frequency of cheating. For those of us who understand that ecosystem, we know that cheating is already very, very high. And so this tool does not introduce more cheating right now. But again, we make recommendations to ensure the citing of these systems and tools so that everyone is clear when they are being used in the classroom. And there are many more topics that I'd like to get into, but I think there's time in the panel discussion for us to talk about some of those, which include the importance of keeping humans in the loop, as well as AI literacy framework that we have just released. So I will stop there so that we can turn to the panel discussion.
Thank you so much, Pati. This has been fantastic. It's a complex topic, and I think you managed to put together many of the key components of this discussion, and I think that put us in a great position to have the conversation. So let me introduce the 2 other panelists that will join us in the conversation today. We have with us today from Boston, Charles Fadel, author of the Education for Age of AI and founder of the Center for Curriculum Redesign. You can have access the book here if you want, and I think we can put it also in the chat. So I'm sure Charles will give us some headlines of the book and why this is important, and we are super pleased that you made time to have this conversation with us, because we really need to have a lot of brain power to understand what are the opportunities and challenges that bring this into education. So very, very welcome. And also I'm very grateful to have Owen Henkel, who is today connected from France. He is the co-author of a study really, really relevant that I strongly recommend to have a look at. We can share that in the link, which study the effectiveness and scalability of AI tutoring systems in Ghana. We see a lot of evidence in the global north, but I think one of the values of this work is shedding light on what could happen in environments which access to connectivity is not always a given. So Owen is also a doctoral research at the University of Oxford in the Department of Education, where I used to spend a lot of time. So I'm very happy to have you with us. And Pati, that also is that you already know, she is coming from Digital Promise. I already introduced her, but just for everybody to know. Someone was asking in the chat whether we will share the slides. I think we can share that at the end. That's completely okay. So without further ado, I think we can give it a go. So the proposal is the following. We will organize a panel in 4 blocks. We're going to discuss a little bit of an introductory approach into what tools are we referring to. We want to understand how these tools impact the use and application of capacities and proficiencies. And then we will navigate into the education system, understanding how AI and the possibilities of these tools can land in low resource settings, which is an area of priority for us. And then we will have a closing on the title of this webinar, which is, what are the challenges for the future? What are the opportunities for education system, which I believe many of us are extremely interested. So if that's okay, let me start with 2 questions. But I invite every panelist to chip in if that's okay. And at some point I'll play the bad cop, moving to the next one. So I think we can start with something very introductory, which is for Owen. What are some of the aspects that make this generative artificial intelligence and these large language models so powerful, so surprisingly effective in some cases, but in some cases so hallucinating, right? And how these tools can be powerful for students, connecting with some of the ideas from Pati, and then we can move to Charles, who can explain us a little bit from the current technologies into the artificial general intelligence. Maybe it will be helpful to understand the difference and whether that could happen soon. But let's start with Owen, if that's okay.
Hey everyone, thanks for joining today. Just a 30-second background on myself. Like Cristobal said, he didn't say this, but I'm very slowly wrapping up a PhD that's focused on large language models in education in Oxford. My other 2 hats is I work with an education group that's in West Africa, and that's what we'll talk about later, but we're kind of developing EdTech products that are focused for the Global South. And then my 3rd project is I work on EdTechnical, which is a podcast with my co-host Libby Hills, who some of you might know. And we kind of try to cover these things, talking to researchers and practitioners. So just a shameless shout out. If you're into this stuff, we have this podcast. I just put a link in there. But I think you're interested in this webinar, you'll probably be also interested in the podcast. But back to your question. Yeah, I think it's a really exciting time. And what might be helpful is just quickly jumping back to what we mean by GenAI. How is it different from normal artificial intelligence? So, maybe about 10 or 15 years ago, there was this idea of good old-fashioned AI. These would be very complicated rules-based systems. This would be like the type of thing, Deep Blue, that beat Garry Kasparov in chess. Then there was a revolution maybe about 5 to 7 years ago, very approximately, about machine learning. So this was a totally new paradigm. It wasn't quite the same rule-based system, but it would use lots of data to learn rules or statistical relationships. And this opened up a whole bunch of other potential uses. In education, machine learning had some good potential use cases, but there were 2 issues with it. It was that you needed lots of data to train these models. And so if you had a very repeated task that millions of students were going to do, then it was worth all that upfront time to train a sophisticated model. But if you think about a normal classroom where like, oh, I just want to do an exit ticket this one time with 30 students, it wasn't going to be worth it to spend 50 hours to train an automatic grader for a one-time exit ticket, obviously. I think the other important thing about the old machine learning paradigm is it was really good at like measuring or classifying things, but it wouldn't produce anything. It would just say, is this right? Is it wrong? How right? How wrong? So it was much more useful for like assessment or tracking student progress. It could do a good and a bad job of that, but it would never create any of its own content. And so when we moved to generative AI, there's this 2 important differences. The first is obviously, as everyone knows, it can produce stuff. So even though kind of the math and the complicated model train that's going on in the background, it's technically a prediction engine, practically speaking, it can produce new and sometimes useful content. So that's the generative in generative AI. I think another thing that is equally important, but is much less spoken about, is that these models do what in computer science speak you call transfer learning very well. So in the old paradigm, I'd train a model for a specific case, let's say grading essays, and then if I try to grade history essays instead of English essays, it might not work. But these large language models, for certain types of tasks, they can actually generalize quite well with a minimal need to retrain the models. And that's also a really key distinction about what's going on. I think that just I'll highlight some big opportunities. And I'm very cognizant that this is not a panacea. For every example I'm going to give you, there's also somewhere where it didn't work. So I'm not trying to be 100% techno-optimist, but as you can tell, I am excited about this stuff. So I have to admit that. There's a category of support tools for teachers. So you could think about this just helping with back office admin, kind of really boring teacher stuff. Used to be a teacher, and I did not always get back to all my parental emails or my filing reports or whatnot. I think it can help if it's used responsibly in marking. I think there's a lot of potential in grading formative or low stakes assessments. I think if you're talking about high stakes assessments, it gets much more complicated. And then there's actually kind of like resources or feedback, like a teacher checking definitions, building out their own knowledge before class. I did my best as a teacher, but there were several classes when I started when I didn't know everything about the topic I probably needed to know. Then there's a bucket of content creation, which you've probably heard a lot about. So this could maybe help with lesson plans. I think there's some good use cases. Oak National Academies in the UK, which is kind of like Khan Academy, is doing some really sophisticated work on this and has started to be able to produce some pretty interesting proto lesson plans. But you can also do it badly. It can definitely turn out garbage. There's personalizing content to interests. I think a really huge opportunity, though, is just adapting reading levels or dealing with students whose English or whatever the language of instruction is a second language. These models are exceptionally good at kind of dealing with translation or simplification tasks in my experience. So I think that's like a huge low-hanging fruit. Like, hey, I'm a second language learner. This is too complicated. Can you simplify it for me first? And then there's a whole bucket of student-facing tools, which I'm, obviously very excited about. I think there's just kind of some type of co-pilot, which might be a little bit like Conmigo, some of you know, where it's like I'm kind of working on the lesson, but if I have a question, I'm going to go say, hey, what's this? And it can maybe help clarify something a bit. And then there's this really big opportunity of AI tutors, which is a big space, lots of hype, lots of promise, but I think there's also lots of hurdles. And that's, Rory, which hopefully I'll get to talk about in a little while, is kind of in that space. But the idea is that in theory, you could have kind of a one-on-one tutor for a lot of educational tasks, which is obviously just not scalable or resource efficient, even in the richest countries, let alone in lower middle income countries. So, there's a huge caveat if, and that's like, size 30 font if, but if you get it to work, it could have just really revolutionary implications for like student learning.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that very, very comprehensive overview. So Charles, how that connect with artificial general intelligence, and what would be the difference here that you see?
Yes, so let me give a very, very quick historical view of how these things develop. It goes all the way back to Markov in 1895, developing probabilities. It continues with Claude Shannon in 1945, developing communication theory. And you can see in that paper how he, by hand, looked at the probability of letters than words showing up after each other in English language. And that's what we're doing now. We can do it now because we have had, since my startup in 1989 on neural networks, which exploded very, very badly, we could only compute 3 layers of neurons. Now we can compute 5,000 layers of neurons, And that's because we've had 100 million times more processing power in the meantime. So a lot of the algorithms have been around for quite a while. It's just that now we have the processing power and the giant data sets at affordable cost. So that's what happened. And to pile on what Owen was saying, what you've seen is the difference between expertise in a narrow domain. You know, you can win at Go, or you can win, or you can fold proteins, or you can sort out drugs or whatever. That was all narrow domains. So in engineering, we call that a bounded problem. And we went from expertise to expertise and transfer, as Owen was saying, because now the data sets are so much broader than just Go or just protein that you can see analogies and extrapolate between various domains. So that's huge. Now, all of this still resides on one type of algorithms. And without going into the details, Owen will also explain this transition between the painstaking description type algorithms, you know, the symbolic AI, to this transition to now, you know, generative AI and the natural language processing, etc., types of algorithms, Markov chains, and so on. But to get to what people call generalized intelligence, meaning the ability to be as smart as one human being, would require ganging up together a bunch of different algorithms. Let me give you a very crude analogy. After millions of years, our brain has evolved, or even an animal brain, has evolved into figuring out that it needed different modules to do different functions. It couldn't come up with the same function out of the same topology of neurons. And so here we are, we have cortex, we have speech areas, we have visual areas, etc., each with different neurons, different topologies, architectures, and so on. So that's a very crude analogy to say that we're not going to get to AGI, generalized intelligence, until we figure out how to bring all different types of algorithms together. And that requires quite a bit of jumps in technology. It's not that trivial. And that's why you are seeing even now somewhat of a saturation of an S-curve of this present class of algorithms, where sure, you've seen between GPT-2 and GPT-3 and 3.5 enormous progress, more to GPT-4, but I'm absolutely convinced that we're going to see saturation with GPT-5, even though the Sam Altman hype machine will tell you, oh no, it's going to be massively better. I think we're seeing diminishing returns, but that's normal. That's how technology evolves. It's always a succession of S-curves. It's not this constantly evolving function. And it's what I really want to say is that this present phase is incredibly powerful. Just because we don't get AGI doesn't mean that from an engineering standpoint, we're going to have a lot to draw from, right? We're going to be able to assemble different data sets from different origins via so-called length chains and APIs. And so that's going to be able to, let's say, improve mathematics because you're drawing on a specific data set, or improve whatever language, etc., multi-language capabilities. We're seeing also very, very efficient systems that are functioning with far less training and far less power. You know, like Poro out of Finland, you know, models like that are going to be incredibly strong. And then you can see even in open source model and Mixtral how much more efficient than they are than the monsters of, you know, GPT, Gemini, and Claude, Anthropic. Those are monsters, but you can see how Llama 2 and particularly Mixtral are becoming a lot more efficient. And I think that a lot of countries are going to push towards the efficiency because they cannot replicate these costs. Mm-hmm. And so that alone is going to be a lot of algorithmic improvement that we're all going to be benefiting from. So that's, in a nutshell, the situation. The present phase is massively interesting. Don't worry about the AGI. You know, who knows when that will come. I would not want to forecast anything at this point. But there's a lot that can be done with the present phase, and that's what we have to keep in mind.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for this framing. I think it's super useful for everybody. Now we are going to move a little bit closer to the educational world. And I want to ask a question that is really at the core of our work, capacities. And I want to pick up on your brain, Pati. We have been for years working in digital skills, and now we have all new set of proficiencies that need to be developed. So based on your experience, what is happening today and what needs to happen to facilitate this idea of an AI literacy? And you also published something about a framework. So if you can give us some ideas on that, should be on the top of, or in addition, or instead, and then I'll hand it over to Charles again on a question that is coming increasingly from teachers. Will my job disappear? Well, let's go with Pati first.
Thank you so much, Cristobal. We've been working on this for a very long time now. We're set to publish our AI literacy white paper that will kind of dig into the framework that we initially published in a blog post that I'm hoping somebody can drop in chat for me. In that blog post, we identified an AI literacy framework. This AI literacy framework builds on the 21st century skills that we've been talking about for many, many years, and many other skills and frameworks that have been around for a long time. So we define AI literacy this way. AI literacy includes the knowledge and skills that enable humans to critically understand, use, and evaluate AI systems and tools to safely and ethically participate in an increasingly digital world. So the framework itself includes the use, the understand, and the evaluate. And we see these three areas all as on-ramps for folks to engage with AI systems and tools. We see people coming into the AI conversation from many different points. Some of them start with the understanding of AI, which includes the technical knowledge set that Charles was just talking about, right? So the skills, the practices, and for AI specifically in the education space, we're thinking computer science and extending those skills and practices, building off of the computational thinking practices that we've been working on for a while, which include using data, creating automations, and underlying skills like algorithmic thinking, pattern recognition, abstraction, and decomposition. So those are the skills and practices around understanding. Then we have the use piece, right? How we interact, how we create, and how we apply using these GenAI tools or AI tools in general. And then the last portion is the evaluating AI. And that includes, for us, the most critical element of AI literacy, because all too often we tend to use these AI systems and tools passively without really considering the socio-cultural topics that I included at the beginning of the talk, the environmental, the labor piece, and also without considering the privacy, safety, and societal impacts of using these tools. And so this is where I think the opportunity lies. And I really, really like something that Owen said earlier as he was answering the question. These GenAI systems and tools are generating sometimes useful content, is the way that Owen framed it. And I really like that, because it's up to us to evaluate that content that's coming. And I think regardless of where we are in terms of use, I think all over the world, we're able to evaluate the use of these systems and tools and begin to identify the opportunities for when it does make sense and when it doesn't make sense. I also have many questions about these AI tutoring models, as Owen alluded to earlier, and I think that these questions all fall in the evaluate portion of our framework, and I think it provides us a lot of opportunities for healthy conversations about these AI systems and tools and where they fit the best.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for this super clear overview. When you say evaluate AI, it makes me think the whole discussion that is taking place today on the internet regarding the video from Kate Middleton, whether it's reliable or not, right? So there are a lot of questions, and even the more educated eyes struggle sometimes. Let's move to Charles with this question that brings a lot of anxiety given the expectations. Will job disappear? What is your approach? And if you can say any word for teachers, which usually ask about that, that would be what.
Well, I'm gonna extend Pati's angle, because that's what will help actually answer your question. First of all, just happened to have written the book 21st Century Skills that she referred to. So thank you, Pati. But that was 2009, way before these things were in the limelight. And then my next book was about AI, but it was in 2018, right before COVID. So no one paid attention. So now, thanks to ChatGPT, people are now into it. But the conversation has been going on for a while, meaning, can you automate my job, but can you also offshore my job, right? So that's been the situation in economics for a while. Can you automate or offshore? And so whether you're a metal worker or a teacher, or whatever, you always have to look at these two dimensions. So if you are teaching only from the perspective of low personalization and low skill level, then it's YouTube. You can be replaced by YouTube. You don't have to have much AI of anything. If, on the other hand, you're doing high personalization and high expertise, it's much harder to replace. And that's even assuming that replacing is a good thing, which it is not. Okay, let's be really clear here. The students need the social engagement. So it's not a replacement, it's adding another person, if you want, in the conversation. So you have the teacher and the student, and now you have the AI. So the AI is going to help the teachers, the AI is going to help the students. So it's now a tripartite, if not a quadripartite conversation going on. So, but continuing on Pati's angle, all of these skills and character quality, what we've done in recent times is a lot of research on which ones of them are complementary with AI and which ones are, let's say, replaceable and which ones are actually going to perdure regardless of AI. So if Marta, if you wouldn't mind projecting the second slide that you had from me while I can continue with this conversation, you will see that there are things that we would assume are hard to replace. For example, people would say, "Oh, creativity, it's such a human thing." I'm sorry, actually, most of creativity is very incremental. A lot of creativity is by analogy and by extrapolation. That is something AI is really good at, actually, analogy and extrapolation. What AI is not good at is coming up with the radical innovation aspect, the imagination aspect, and that's where humans would continue having a stronger role. The problem is you're not going to get, even as a human, to be very innovative, very radically imaginative, unless you also do the not tedious, but I mean the regular work of incremental innovation. In other words, even Mozart had to do a lot of run-of-the-mill pieces to come up with a brilliant piece every once in a while. So that's the tension here, because education cannot say, "Oh, we're not going to scaffold the student, just come up with the imagination stuff." No, you still have to scaffold the student as well as push on the imagination angle. And that's just the example of creativity. Think of critical thinking, courage, all the elements of our framework. And, we don't have time, but that's a ton of details about that competency by competency in the book. And you note this triangle on the right, which is about pushing for personalization. And this is where I rejoin Owen in this conversation about intelligent tutoring systems, and it's not just that, it's also just the pedagogical approach by the teacher to push for a sense of motivation. In other words, our brains are tuned for so-called cognitive misering, meaning we're lazy. our brains are lazy by good evolutionary design. And so if you have something that's going to do the work with you for you, your tendency is going to be to not try very hard. So how can we motivate you to continue trying? Well, by personalizing, helping you develop your identity and belonging, your agency and growth mindset, and your purpose and passion. And now we can really push the student forward with the scaffolding and with the complementarity with AI. So to wrap it up, jobs are nowhere near going to disappear, but think of it as a human discovering the wheel many, many thousands of years ago. I'm sure there were other humans that said, oh, you know what, the wheel, these new technologies, that's not my thing. Fine, I'm going to go much faster, much further, and carrying heavier loads than you can. And so, the competition is really against other humans using AI, because that's a force multiplier. It's like an exoskeleton that allows you to carry heavier loads, mentally speaking. And so that's really the angle here. The jobs are way too complex. They're not just a mono task. Most jobs are multiple tasks. And it's really hard to imagine a scenario where every single one of these tasks would be automated, and you have a glue function, like a conveyor belt, that brings you from one task to the next, to the next, to the next, to the next. That's not how jobs are. So if we get to AGI, will some of these things start happening? Perhaps. But again, right now, there's much, much more to be done about the here and now of not just how do you teach in the classroom tomorrow, but how do you reshape the curricula, as Pati started indicating, to pay attention to AI, digital literacy, computer science, but also social sciences, psychology, sociology, anthropology, entrepreneurship, modernizing mathematics, why so much trigonometry and so little on algorithms, etc.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for helping us to navigate between automating and outsourcing work. I think that's the right kind of balance and discussion that we should have. Let me now move a little bit into the AI for the Global South, how these tools can be used and accessed and in environments where connectivity is not a given, or there are many other constraints. So I want to get back to Owen, and also, again, for those who are coming later, you did a very interesting work in Ghana. So give us a little bit of your vision in terms of what significance can have these kind of discussions and these kind of tools in settings where access to connectivity devices is not a given. And do you have any concern how the hindering the access, or not only access, right? I mean, protection of data and other practices can be taken into account when we are talking with countries, which in many cases, this is a little bit far-fetched. I think you're mute.
About that, guys. Yeah, absolutely. So I think just taking a step back, there's this idea, it's actually from reading research, but it's Stanovich coined this idea of Matthew effects, where what happens is that if you have an initial advantage, in this case reading, that you become better at reading, you enjoy reading more, and you get better and better at reading. And so I think that there is as you can tell, I don't think it's going to fix everything, but I really do think that like well-designed educational applications using GenAI can really improve student learning, the good ones. I think there's a real risk of a gating function, that kind of the students who have the most resources will get first access to these. They're already on pretty stable ground, so their parents will be okay. Like, oh, my kid will be okay. Let them experiment in a safe environment with this cool new Gen AI thing. And so like they'll kind of nature get first access to it. And then also on a really simple level, there's just device access. So I see a huge potential, a really scary opportunity where kind of the already most advantaged students get first access to these, and then like we see these global learning gaps just accelerate. So I think that's a real risk, honestly, I do. And so I think that but there's this huge opportunity also here where that low hanging, I think that some of the best use cases for LLMs are low-hanging fruit in the terms of like basic practice, knowledge acquisition, and even think about teachers. If you're going to Ghana, and when I go to Ghana, I'm usually mainly on the coast, so it's a little bit more developed. But if you go up north in Ghana, like a teacher training program maybe happens every 2 years, and it's like a day to get to the regional center, and you're there with 500 people, and these teachers are working their tails off. They want to do better, but they just don't have access. And suddenly, if you have a conversational way to access all of human knowledge, that's potentially a really powerful tool. Like, it's not going to work out on its own, but like the potential is massive there. And so, but I come back to this device issue. I think these are rough numbers, but if you think about students or teachers, at least 80% of students and teachers in low and middle income countries don't have reliable access to a laptop or a desktop, and don't have reliable access to like landline or high-speed internet. It's a huge issue because when we think about ChatGPT, we think about our laptop. But about 80% of teachers and students in low and middle income countries do have at least sometimes access to a budget smartphone and do live in an area with 3G connectivity. So that's obviously a disadvantage. But then the second thing is, at least with language models, it's text-based. And so you start thinking there is some opportunity here. These budget phones, again, cost issues, video-based platforms. I love Khan Academy. Like, if I had a child, I would have them on all the time, but it's video-based. And realistically, again, if you're in rural Ghana, even if you have a phone, you're not going to be able to pay the costs of streaming those videos. That's just a reality here. So you need to think about a data light application that works on a budget smartphone. I think that is the way that you could think about a majority of global learners would have access to this tool. That obviously constricts the design space of what kind of educational experience you deliver to students, but I still think there's a lot of potential there. So sorry, that was a pretty rambly prologue, but just talk more about this specific study. And I put some links in here in case it's helpful. I have been working with an organization called Redesign for a couple of years, kind of in a research partnership and helping them design this product. It's called Rory. This is a chat AI math tutor. That's kind of maybe the hypey name for it. What it essentially it's an intelligent tutoring system that teaches math through a conversational interface, and it's delivered on WhatsApp. So it takes students through a pre-designed curriculum that's based on the Global Proficiency Framework, which is developed by World Bank, among others, which is kind of a set of global learning standards. And it has micro lessons where the students practice math concepts. You could have done that 5 years ago without GenAI. Where the GenAI comes in is that it allows natural language interactions with students. So instead of just saying, if the kid gets it wrong, saying try again, try again, try again, they can say, hey, what don't you get about this? And the student was like, oh, I'm confused about so-and-so. And in the background, you pass that student question to an LLM to generate an on-the-fly helpful response. And then you take them back to the structured curriculum. And that's the basic idea. These links here, there's a paper, but also there's like a 3-minute YouTube video. If any of you are interested, you can just kind of get a sense of what's going on with Rory. I think the other key point is this is based on teaching at the right level, mastery-based learning, which has a really robust global evidence base. That if you basically take students, assess where they're at, and teach them at their level rather than at their nominal grade level, that's how you see learning gains. Benjari, Duflo, like the recent Nobel laureates, like they did some really kind of bulletproof work on teaching at the right level in the real world, like with teachers, with humans, no AI involved. But we're saying like, hey, how might we be able to do that with technology? It's early days. We've been doing these pilots for about a little over a year, but we did a year 1 efficacy trial and got some really exciting results. So we randomized schools within the Redesign Academy network. So these students were very similar, from similar socioeconomic backgrounds. They were on the same curriculum, the same timetable, etc. But about 5 schools got to use Rory for 1 hour a week. That was it. And the other 5 schools didn't. And we had about 600 students over an 8-month period, pre-test, post-test. And when we measured it, there are really substantial learning gains, relative learning gains. Students in the control schools improved about 10% in percentage terms in their math score. Rory was more than double that. The effect size, for those of you familiar with that, was approximately 0.35, which is pretty chunky. That's like a really big learning gain effect size. Now, of course, this was a small trial. As we all know in educational interventions, when you try to massively scale high fidelity educational interventions, the effect size almost always goes down. So I'm not here saying that like we guarantee 0.35, but you're like, even if you take that in half, you start talking about 0.15, 0.20, that's pretty substantial. If you deliver that on budget smartphones, you start squinting, these types of things might be scalable. The marginal cost of delivering Rory in terms of like API data costs is about $5 per year. So it's very early days, but I think that, that is a pretty exciting idea. Oh, and sorry guys, someone said that the video isn't available. I'll try to make that available. Give me 1 second. Apologies for that. But hopefully, did that kind of answer your question, Cristobal?
That was brilliant. I love the message of prioritize text, mobile first. I think these are messages that will resonate among our community. I saw a hand from Charles. Charles, wanted to mention something.
Yes, so Owen's efforts are absolutely fabulous. It reminds me, though, of a conversation I've had with Mike Trucano a few years ago when I was still at Cisco. The divide isn't really low versus middle versus high-income countries. It's urban versus rural, right? So in Ghana, in Accra, you have reasonable connectivity, you have laptops, et cetera, et cetera. It's in the hinterlands of any country, even the United States, where you don't have access to bandwidth and devices, et cetera. So that's, in my view, how one needs to segment the market from a marketing perspective, saying Owen solutions are useful for these segments in particular, whereas other segments would benefit from different capabilities and intensities rather than low versus middle. Low income is unfair because even in a low income, you have a high density situation and low density. So that's not.
I think you're spot on about that. Yeah.
Yeah. No, well, it's spending 25 years in marketing, kind of tweaks you this way. The second, the issue of teacher quality and availability is a question everywhere, right? And so again, you take Owen's systems, souped up ITSs and so on, and you can see how, you have, even in the US or whatever, you have situations where you have a substitute teacher that knows nothing about math, is a physical ed teacher who's just sitting there as a warm body to keep the kids safe. And in which case, you can imagine the ITS taking over. You can also imagine a situation where, a bit like nurses versus doctors in healthcare, where if you cannot have a doctor, you're going to have a nurse plus AI that's going to be at least partially as powerful, if not more powerful than a doctor. So I think we're going to see that approach emerge quite a bit. And so whether it's quality issues or availability of teachers issues, I think ITSs are going to really help everybody. And lastly, the Harvard Business School have done a study about consultants and how much consultants are being helped by AI. And the really cool thing is that the bottom 50% of consultants were far more helped by AI to boost their level than the top 50% of consultants for whom AI was a diminishing returns situation. So you take those unprepared, not very trained teachers, and you boost them up thanks to AI. That becomes a true equalizer in education. Again, you're never going to replace the top-notch teacher with all the top-notch tools, but you can try to at least bring up the distribution, narrow the distribution with all these capabilities to come.
Yeah. Hey, Cristobal, so there was 2 quick questions on the chat. Could I triage them quickly? It'll take me 30 seconds each.
Yes, please.
Okay. Yeah, I think the first one was about power consumption, Bridget. And I think that these estimates are about training the foundational models, which take a lot of time, but then it's not about the incremental use of them. So the incremental use of like querying ChatGPT or something like that is microscopic. It's that to train ChatGPT in the first place, they have to run 500 computers for 6 months. So I think that like the incremental energy impact of large language models is completely insignificant. It's more about like doing the initial training run. And then Isabel, the students in the control group, they were doing normal classes. So they were getting 5 to 6 hours of math instruction every week. And then they had a study hall where they could do what they want. You know, Rising schools are amazing. They do great work. They're great people. But like study halls in any school aren't always the most productive thing. Whereas in the treatment group, we just use study hall. And so for 1 hour a week, they did this. So basically they kind of got, but there weren't teachers there. It was completely independent practice. So this is kind of saying, hey, what if you give them a structured independent practice for about an hour a week? And I think just context, the Rory students, the treatment group, improved 5 raw score points over the course of the year, whereas the control students improved 2 raw score points. So one way of thinking about this is an entire year of schooling in a normal class, 6 hours a week, led to about 2 points of improvement. And then the single incremental hour of Rory each week led to 3 points of improvement. Lots of ways you can cut this, but I think that that's why we were excited by it. Various approximate numbers, of course.
Let me go to the last question that all of you will have chance to address, and we can pick up your ideas, Charles, as well, which is recommendations for policymakers which are interested in education. So I'll hand it over to Pati on helping us to identify the unforeseen challenges, but also some recommendations. But I would love to pick up your brain, Charles and Owen, on what are the 2 or 3 messages that you think are important to convene? Because today, in the session of today, we have colleagues which are policymakers in different continents. So I think highlighting some of the key messages, how do teachers see? What is the key skill or something that you consider relevant as a takeaway message before we move to hear the word from Mike? I think will be extremely helpful. But let's start with you first, if that's okay.
I alluded to this in the opening that I gave, but it's important for both teachers and students to be given very clear guidance on appropriate use of these tools. So really thinking through appropriate use in your context is going to be incredibly important, and then providing guidance, right? And we know that each context, depending on the community, the students, the learners, the families, they need different types of guidance. They have different access to the technology, as Owen was alluding to earlier, and they will have different needs, right? So ensuring that you're adapting the policy to encompass the needs of your community, while also identifying from us the AI literacy practices that are appropriate to address within that policy, right? So the AI literacy framework that we have, we are coming out with a white paper in the middle of May, so please keep an eye out for that. In that white paper, we're going to be giving a lot more content on the specific AI literacy practices and what educators, families, and communities can be looking for to address all of those. And those practices, which are very important, include specific data practices, which is about analyzing and organizing data sets. Another practice is around automation. Another one, which is important for all communities, is understanding data privacy, security, and the ownership of the use of that data, which we think is an incredibly important starting point to have these conversations about what personal identifying information is being collected from us, when we're using these tools and technologies, and how might we prevent these tools that we might not necessarily have ownership over, but how might we prevent them from collecting our data, or how are we able to delete our data? Additionally, investigating model transparency and supporting users to understand what data methods are being used to train these AI systems and tools is important. Understanding the impact and examining the credibility of inputs. We all know in the US we have an election coming soon, and it's incredibly important to be able to make sense of and question the biases that are inherent in these tools that we are using. And then finally, the ethical perspective, right? Considering how data sets, including their accessibility, so can all people use these tools, and the representation within the outputs of these generative AI tools, are they also representative? Or what biases are they reproducing in our society, and how can we identify those? Because we do know that these models have biases. They will, right? They're generated, as I said at the top, based on human-based inputs, and as humans, we're bringing our biases. So ensuring that folks are able to consider who the AI systems and tools are harming, who is benefiting from them, and how they might take action, right? So that these AI systems and tools do not perpetuate issues. One of just the very easy teaching devices that I use when I teach educators about AI systems and tools is that I ask them to consider, and this is not something that I came up with. I credit Emily Bender at the University of Washington for this concept. But simply replacing the word AI with automation, and then asking themselves questions about what harms might these automations be perpetuating, who these automations benefit, and I think that can take us a long way in better understanding how to begin to guide folks and develop policy around these systems and tools.
That's brilliant, Pati. Thank you so much. You gave us a very comprehensive navigation route how to tackle. Who would like to follow? Please, let's go with Charles, and then we finish with Owen.
Oh, thank you, Cristobal. So very quickly to answer Isabel Lopez's question about languages and languages that have, low density of users and so on. This is very germane, of course, in the context of many countries. Look, you're never going to have data sets in Ndebele that are as large as data sets in Swahili, as are large as data sets as English. So don't even think that's going to happen. It's much wiser to think, how can I take even English information and get it translated into my language of choice? And adjust, of course, for biases and contexts and so on. But you're never going to replicate the power of a language like English or even French or even whatever, any one of the major languages of the world. And the 80-20 rule that happens with languages, right? So past Urdu and some of the others, that's it. You're on your own. So many countries have secondary languages, tertiary languages. They're never going to be addressed. So, and even if the LLMs are capable of taking their content and playing with them, the content is not that large. So if you really want good, let's say, teaching and learning information, you have no choice, honestly, practically speaking, than to draw from English data sets, translate automatically with lots of tools out there, and then fix for context. All right, so for policymakers, because they're not technology wise or educated, they confuse three things. They confuse access with the what of education with the how of education. So they confuse giving you a computer and bandwidth with teaching you AI at the digital literacy level or at the computer science level, two separate levels of complexity, with teaching with technology, so EdTech in general, of which teaching via AI tools, but not only AI tools, could be AR, VR, could be all sorts of other things. And so even at the OECD, where I spend a lot of time, I see these people, the ministry people, completely confusing these three things. And that's one of the things we need to constantly explain to policymakers. Just giving someone access does not tell the ministries or the departments of education how to reshape the what. And just doing that does not tell the teachers how to use the technology in the classroom. Three separate problems have to have three separate types of solutions. So that's my constant message to policymakers, and I'm sure you all have similar messages to them.
Thank you. That's brilliant. I think that set a lot of much more focalized and granular conversations, and I appreciate that. Let's move to Owen, which I'm still thinking in that phrase that you say that AI can produce useful content sometimes. So let's hear from you. What would be your recommendations at the policymaking level?
I think that, just to step back, like, I think we're fooling ourselves if we don't think this is going to become a really big part of education. Like, I work on weird esoteric things. I would used to spend hours in like Stack Exchange forums trying to figure out how to code some weird stats principle that I didn't really understand the coding or the statistics. And now, like, I just spend 30 minutes and I suddenly understand a whole new like kind of subgenre of stats, and I can also implement it in Python. The key thing though is that I already have a broad-based knowledge, and I kind of have a very clear idea of what I do and don't know in my own area, and I have a very clear learning goal that I'm pursuing as, I guess, as a motivated adult learner. So in that case, they're amazing. But that's not the same for an 8-year-old. The 8-year-old has no idea what they do and don't know. If they're super interested about something, you can let them loose and they'll learn a ton about, I don't know, you pick it, or like strange, fun thing flies that they're interested in at the moment. But there's no curriculum, there's no sense of these goals. And so I think that a key need is like people who understand both the technical capabilities of these models and kind of have a real sense of pedagogy and how people learn. And this idea, like, if you're kind of lost, you're not going to learn anything. And so designing products that take that on board is super important. I think the second thing is that for global policymakers, just to get really, sometimes it's hard, but really realistic about like what kind of device I have. Because, I think what's really exciting is we now have the tools to design for populations who previously would have had no chance for giving these tools to. But if we kid ourselves like, oh yeah, we're going to get high-speed internet, up north in 2 years, that will actually stop someone coming up with a really important workaround to work on budget smartphones. So there's this idea about kind of like being realistic about the tools you have at the moment and like kind of taking the user-centered design approach about building the tools there. So that's like, the recap is like, you need teams that have both deep technical expertise and deep kind of learning science or pedagogy expertise, and those two need to work together closely. And secondly, you kind of have to be honest about where your infrastructure is, because there is a solution for almost any environment, but they're going to be different. So what's going to work in New York City is not going to work in Tamale. And that's okay. Like, we still have really powerful learning experiences for students in both areas.
Wonderful. I think all of you have underscored that this one-size approach is not going to work here. So I strongly applaud that message for the audience. There are so many questions in the chat that we could not go in full detail. Some people asking about data security, how to use that as an opportunity for language of instruction, how to do smart investment where there are not enough resources. What are the priorities that need to be done in low resource settings? But I think you have provided a huge wealth of examples. I strongly everybody recommend to share links that you think can be relevant for this community. Now we are going to hand over to my colleague, Mike Trucano, who is currently visiting fellow at the Center for Universal Education at the Brookings Institution, who will shed some light on some of these discussions and final remarks.
Thanks so much, Cristobal, and thanks Charles and Owen and Pati. I think it was a great discussion, and yeah, maybe more questions than we have answers, but acknowledging that I think is a good first step and a practical way to approach things. You know, Pati started out by talking and referencing some guidance that the U.S. Department of Education gave last spring about, and she spoke of generative AI as an electric bike. And I think that's, you know, for me, it recalls Steve Jobs talking about a bicycle for the mind in the early days of the Apple computers. And, you know, thinking about things like that, and Charles talking about, you know, working with. And recently, when I was out in Silicon Valley at Stanford, you know, Stanford students are maybe only representative of Stanford students, but I was struck by the number of people who were talking about collaborating with an AI. And, you know, I don't say that I collaborate with my bicycle when I'm driving down the street to the store, but, you know, maybe I should. I don't know. But I think this issue of the potential for collaboration, I think, is something I wanted to highlight. You know, and Pati also talked about, you know, the choice, and I think Owen talked about this as well, you know, choosing the right tool for the right challenge in the right way. One of the big challenges we have, I think, with this emerging class of generative AI tools is like, increasingly they're everywhere and we don't have a choice. We may not even, are they there? Are they not there? To what extent? What does that mean? So I think even the questions we're asking today are tentative, or a number of them are tentative in ways that perhaps make us uncomfortable. But that's the reality. And the environmental cost, I think, and Owen responded to a question about that Pati mentioned. You know, Kate Darling, I think, has a great book where she tries to quantify what some of these things are. I would recommend people have a look at that. And, you know, the IP issue as well. I think Pati brought up some issues, you know, who owns what, or what does this mean, and who has rights, and maybe who gets paid for these things. These are questions that are important. And yet there are different questions in different parts of the world. If you have countries saying, okay, there aren't data in digital formats that have been used to train your model, and you want to come in our country and take advantage of our labor, and we want to license that and get paid for that, okay, that's a legitimate response. But on the other hand, if that impedes the development of tools that are actually of use to a population of students, I think there are trade-offs there. And I mean, if Google's only paying $50 million to Reddit for the access to all of their data, one does question perhaps what an appropriate price, if indeed we should put a price on the development of some of the data sets in various parts of the world. Owen talked about support tools for teachers, and I think this initial use case is really an important one. It's a practical one. It's a useful one. He talked about a whole bunch of good things we can do, and he gave us some cautions about, for example, the use of these sorts of tools for high stakes assessment. I think this gets at the main, a main sort of guidance, and this comes out of the Teach AI policy guidance as well, just about, you know, when you're doing things that are really important, the importance of, or the need to have humans in the loop. Where there are, whether we're talking about assessment, whether they're talking about judgments made about students that are really consequential for their learning, for their lives, having a human in the loop and knowing where such decisions, there are indeed decisions being made, is going to be increasingly critical, I think, going forward. Owen also and Charles gave some great history about how we've gotten to where we are, and highlighted, I think Owen highlighted, the AI tutor, or the AI chatbot as like the thing that a lot of people are really excited about. I think building on 30, 40 years of interest and marketing, and some reality about personalized learning and the potential of technology to enable personalized learning. And I think this is sort of the next phase of development there. And Charles also talked about, large language models and small language models, and the ability perhaps to have things being done more efficiently or at the edges. The class of tools, what's called in small language models, I think are going to be things that are going to be increasingly relevant, especially to a lot of the places that the World Bank works in around the world. And then Charles, talked about, and you asked him about, will jobs disappear? Will teachers disappear? I think, and Pati said automation. What if we substitute the word automation whenever we talk about AI? What would that mean? I mean, the history of the use of technology, new technologies, is initially a history of people being afraid of automation and of replacing what people do now and the people who do it. And over time, while there are groups that are replaced, we need to be clear about that. And there are tasks that are replaced over time. There tends to be a need for more people. Automated teller machines didn't replace bank tellers, or at least didn't replace them for 50 years. Maybe after 50 years, in fact, they have. But there is a curve where we get worried about things. And then as we enable new types of opportunities and new types of activities, we should be thinking not only about the potential for things being replaced, or what can teachers do now that they couldn't do before. Owen highlighted that, the potential of AI to perhaps get rid of some grunt work for teachers, and that would be great. Some basic scoring and interactions. Let's hope that's the case. It needn't be the case, though. Of course, administrators could look at teachers saying, wow, you're so much more efficient at that kind of work. We're just going to give you a whole lot more. So I think we need to be careful about some of the assumptions we make about actually what the incentives are, what the actual use cases might turn out to be, because I think all of us are used to being surprised when we talk about what the actual impact of technology is in education for teaching and learning. And, I think at the end, talked about issues related to whether Matthew effects. I think both Owen and Charles talked about in different ways about this, that people who are better equipped to take advantage of what the tools offer tend to. And this gets at the potential of maybe a new element or a new type of digital divide that AI may introduce. And I do wonder if, and I had a number of, let's say, unfortunate conversations with policymakers who said things like, well, we don't have enough teachers in this place, they're not trained enough, let's give the kids AI. That sounds great. Certainly, if you don't have a teacher or a well-trained teacher enough, these could certainly add real value. But I think there is a worry, and as costs come down, and maybe this is a fanciful concern, but I don't know that we could have a future where in the past digital divide was rich kids had technology and poor didn't, and in the future where the poor kids have the technology and the rich kids have the technology and the people. And I think that is the challenge of our times, and I think it's something that we all in our various roles will be confronting and perhaps hopefully advocating against. But I think it's a natural tendency that we need to be on guard against. So at the end, and I think this stuff is increasingly going to be everywhere. We're not sure where it's going to be or what the impact is going to be, and I really think discussions like this are useful in sharing sort of emerging experiences, emerging lessons, emerging findings, emerging perspectives, and a lot of them are probably going to change, but that's okay. And I think it's, hopefully as we try to come to better conclusions or even better questions, hopefully we can collaborate with AI in useful ways.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mike. For me, the measure of success of an event is when you leave the event with more questions than answers. I think that's the right trend. I think that's the case here. And I love the idea of the bicycle for the mind. I believe some teachers think that this is more a pillow for the mind, but we will see how it goes. And I think there are a little bit of both. But let's move on to the closing remarks from our close friend, Chris Purifoy, who is very kind to join us. He's CEO and chairman from Learning Economy Foundation for the final remarks.
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone. This was such an exciting conversation. And I mean, it's a subject that, you find yourself in these types of conversations, and it's such a unique atmosphere, right? Because generally the conversations about emerging technologies are like, what can we do? And how exciting is this? And, this one's comes so layered with kind of friction as well. We have to look at how this is going to disrupt everything, and what does that mean? And, how does this create more divide? Does this help us solve huge problems? Is it going to take over all of our jobs? Is it going to make education obsolete? Is it going to make it a million times better? And it's just such an interesting subject when the conversation is questions, right? I'm so used to these types of things where you can just, let me tell you what it is. And this is such a unique, different place. We're all kind of swimming around in a pond and looking at the lily pads and saying, look, this is really interesting. But we can't quite see the whole picture yet. And that's both exciting and incredibly anxious. And so, really unique time with this. And, I was going to kind of do very similar to what Mike did, but he did such a great job at summarizing. So I won't do that again. But maybe I will add a couple of new ideas to the mix, if that makes sense. This is, I think, our 12th convening. We're really happy to be able to collaborate with you on this one. This is a really exciting topic. And generally, the convenings that we have done have dealt a lot with how do we empower the individual learner to be kind of at the center of their data and of their future. How do we put them in the driver's seat? And obviously AI, came along and it was like, wow, we have to look at this because this is obviously going to potentially change everything. And so, I'll say this, I think a couple of interesting trends or ideas have emerged in light of that. One is that, I don't know if you're familiar with GitLab, but they recently did kind of an AI cohort for education and workforce and, gave several $1 million out to lots of different organizations. And, after the cohort was closed, they kind of did a survey, what are your challenges? What are you really trying to figure out? What's, so on. And it turns out the challenge wasn't we need more compute or we need more talent or we need to learn how to do new tricks. It was actually, how do we get access to this data and do it responsibly, right? Which is kind of a surprising answer because when you think about education, there's a really huge, really difficult challenge when it comes to all of the different privacy laws, all the different siloed data spaces, and so I only put this out there to say for those who are working in this space, I think this is an important challenge we need to think about. How do we start to understand how to pipe all of this data together in a way that's responsible, that puts learners at the center with consent, and that allows for us to start to understand the migration between systems, because we have a really hard challenge as educators, right? When someone leaves a school or a university or an employer, they vanish and we don't really know what happened to them. We don't know, did they go on to create skills, to have great jobs, to create a great life? And these are really, really tough challenges. And I think AI, along with really smart, responsible data tools, can help us start to get back at that lifelong learning and start to use that data to optimize for pathways and outcomes and all sorts of things. And in our space, we talk a lot about learning and employment records, which is maybe a term you've heard or maybe you haven't. In our space, we only call it an LER, which so we speak in acronyms. But this learning and employment record is an interesting moment, I think, also for AI because it provides a space where we can start to onboard. There's a lot of conversation today about so what happens with the learner if you don't know anything about them? Is it one size fits all? Is it the teacher going to guide them? Are they going to, try to figure out how to ask the right questions? And I think there's a real opportunity with AI if we can onboard the individual to really find that personalized education we've always talked about and we've always wished for, But the key to that, I think, is to understand where they are when they arrive, So I think the tools that we can build, which can help us on board and can help us understand who that learner is right from the get-go, are going to make these tools really impressive. And this idea of what happens to education, maybe it does change where the teacher becomes more of like a tour guide. They're helping you along the way versus being the only one who's imparting knowledge. And I also think that there's, I'll leave it here, which is, with a bit of a, provocative idea maybe. Is it possible that this move into AI with AGI, with all of the changing things that are happening with knowledge at everyone's fingertips and everyone is an expert, does this just mean that it's time to kind of catalyze into durable skills as where we should be going in the future? Because it seems to me that creativity, leadership, critical thinking, these types of durable skills that have generally not necessarily been taught in schools are now becoming maybe the most important skills we have, right? Because is it true, and I just postulate the question, that an advanced PhD expertise maybe isn't going to matter as much anymore? We hope that's not true because we've spent all of our money on them. And a lot of people in this calls are probably like, no, how dare you? But this is kind of what's happening. If all of a sudden I have access to a terminal that can give me, that can write, incredible research papers in 10 seconds, maybe at the end of the day, what we need to be teaching are durable skills. And maybe this is that catalyst that can create that Cambrian explosion toward, a future where you know, we have leaders and team members and critical thinkers who can help us be generalists and use these tools to do exciting things. So I just want to say thanks to everyone. This has been such an exciting panel. Chris, you did a great job, moderating this conversation. And we just want to invite you all to continue innovating here and to do it safely and report back, because we want to hear what you're doing and we want to hear where you're going. So we look forward to seeing you again next time.
Fantastic, fantastic. Thank you so much, Chris. I love the closing message that you bring to put the endurable skills at the center and not the technology. I think that's a fantastic way of closing today. So thank you so much, everybody, for making your time here. I think we have learned a lot. It's been a brilliant session. Apologies for all the questions that we could not respond, but we're going to share them with the panelists. We're going to share as well the presentation and the recording session as well later on. But for the time being, I think this has been remarkable for us. Grateful for your time, for the ideas, and use this bicycle for making the best of your mind. Have a great one, and we'll stay in touch.